into this vacuum, something was always going to step. And there is no reason why American or other Western universities or streets, because it's not just at higher education institutions, it's, Union Station in New York shut down again the other week by hundreds of people chanting for intifada.
Yeah.
Intifada terrorism in the center of New York. What it is there's no reason why this death cult ideology should find itself worshipped in the free West, apart from the fact that we have allowed ourselves to be deracinated and demoralized and allowed the weakest and most pernicious imaginable ideology to step into the vacuum.
There's an assortment of weak and appalling ideologies, most particularly the idea that the world can be explained in consequence of the oppressor-victim narrative.
Yes, right. Oppressor, oppressed, colonizer, colonized.
Yeah. Proletariat, bourgeoisie, it's the same bloody story.
There's another strand to that, by the way, which I gave a lecture on this in New York last year for the New Criterion, which is that even if somebody does use the term evil in the West these days, and people are very uncomfortable about using it because of its theological framework. If you do hear the word evil used in the West, in the Western press, I give examples of this, what will people describe it as? Almost inevitably, they will resort to Hannah Arendt's lamentable definition of the banality of evil. And if anyone is interested, they can go and read the essay online that I wrote about against Hannah Arendt's appalling, misguided, and provably wrong theory on the banality of evil, which she applied to Eichmann, the leading Nazi and architect of the Holocaust.
The facade is banal.
There was nothing about Eichmann that was banal. He just fooled Hannah Arendt. But she through her half-baked theory, that's the last bit of the use of evil I noticed in the public realm. Something will happen, like, for instance, when drummer Lee Rigby was beheaded in broad daylight on the streets of London in 2013. The next day, a columnist at the Telegraph, a conservative newspaper in the UK, described the act as banal. The Guardian
that means it didn't happen to
said
him.
It was a sort of, yes, exactly. It's hard to see decapitation as banal unless you just have no other word to use in the environment of evil. But one of the things I want readers to come away from On Democracies and Death Cults thinking about is exactly this. Maybe there is such a force in the world. Maybe evil really does descend. Maybe it actually exists.
So when did you come to that conclusion? Like what, and is that a theological conclusion? I mean, when you start talking about the landscape of good and evil, you're perilously close to the religious world, or you're in it.
Yeah,
when I
absolutely.
dealt with my clinical clients that were severely hurt by malevolent actors, the language became religious because there was no other way of discussing it.
Yes.
And that had nothing to do with my machinations. There was no language they could use to describe what happened to them that wasn't profound enough to touch on the religious, because the depth of horror was so great that no other language sufficed.
Well, I would say one of this, and you know this well from your work on the Bible, but one of the things I suppose that would stand out as a definition of evil is doing it knowingly and gleefully and glorying in it. And that's one of the things.
There's a level underneath that. It's doing it knowingly and gleefully to spite God. Right. You don't understand evil. I don't think you understand evil if you don't understand it as the ultimate in rebellion against the fact of existence itself, the spirit of existence. Well, hence death cult.
Well, but then the layer underneath that is where death is offered up as a form of worship. Now, this is something the Western mind finds incredibly hard to understand within the death cults within Islam. We have some understanding about it when this arises in the form of Nazi fascism or Soviet communism, some understanding, or Maoist communism, even less understanding. But
or serial killing pathology.
Serial killers. We could. I think we still might be able to identify Jeffrey Dahmer, or the Yorkshire Ripper as
worshippers of death and suffering, right? Sadism taken to its extreme.
But imagine that with a theological framework around it, such as the kind the jihadists have. This is why, when you ask why I sort of was mulling on this, it was because of something I couldn't get out of my head from the 7th onwards, which was that I've seen quite a lot of war and how people act in war, and regard myself as relatively unshockable, or at least aware of the capacity of human evil. But from the moment I started seeing the videos that Hamas took themselves on the morning, and I started seeing them very early, I then saw an awful lot of them, and then far more, even before going to the massacre sites myself, and the hospitals and the morgues and so on. But one of the things I could not get out of my head was the glee, the sheer orgiastic glee of the terrorists.
At least the Nazis tried to hide their crimes.
Well, this is a point I've made that has occasionally got me into trouble. It's not. What happened on the 7th was as if, for some hours in Treblinka, the Nazis had live streamed to the world what they were doing.
Right.
And were proud of it and wanted everyone to know.
And then the universities celebrated it.
I quote a late friend of mine early in the book, as you know, who fled Nazi Germany, Nazi Austria in 1938. And he said towards the end of his life to me and to a historian friend, he said that he had spent his last years thinking, actually, maybe there was a level of anti-Semitism even worse than the Nazis.
And hell is a bottomless pit,
Absolutely.
Really.
And it required somebody who had fled Nazism and lost much of his family to Nazism to be able to, in a way, make that point. But the thing, we don't need to get into the competition of, as it were, which is how people see it, but it doesn't diminish anything. But this thing of the ecstasy in death, the ecstasy in bringing death. I quote the young man who phones back to his family in Gaza on a cell phone and says, Father, I've killed 10 Jews with my own hands, I've killed 10 Jews. Get mother on the phone. Mm-hmm. Turn on to WhatsApp video. I can show you. The endless cries of Allahu Akbar, which, as I said shortly after the 7th, is not something I wanted to hear chanted on our streets much more, knowing this isn't simply an offering of prayer like the Lord's Prayer. And if Christians had in recent memory been massacring people whilst screaming the Lord's Prayer in ecstasy, I think that Christians would have the decency to pipe down a bit about shouting it in public squares en masse. But the cry of Allahu Akbar that we're forever told is simply like, it's just a prayer. Like saying Sieg Heil in America is just a quoting of German. The use of Allahu Akbar by the terrorists as they're removing a young man's head with a shovel or raping girls and then killing them.
Thinking ahead in most everything usually ends up saving you time and money. It's kind of like mapping out your route before a road trip rather than figuring it out as you go. The same goes for creating a trust and a will. Creating a trust and will doesn't have to be a headache. The traditional way can eat up so much time that you might keep putting it off. That's why trust and will is such a game changer. They've made the process quick and straightforward so you can get it done and move on with your life. It's one of those important things that feels great to check off your list without the usual hassle. And now you can get 20% off at trustandwill.com/Peterson. Planning for the unexpected isn't just responsible, it's peace of mind. Setting up a will or a trust used to mean lengthy appointments and paperwork, but now you can handle everything online in a way that's actually tailored to your situation. Whether you need to name guardians for your kids, outlining your care wishes, or set up power of attorney, these documents are created specifically for your state's laws. Plus, they make the whole process super straightforward. You just answer one question at a time, and before you know it, you're done. Everything gets stored securely in one place with top-notch encryption, which saves your family from scrambling to find important papers later on. And if you get stuck, their support team is ready to help by phone, chat, or email, whatever works best for you. Having the peace of mind knowing your trust and will is properly and easily taken care of, it isn't just nice, it's literally a life changer. Uncomplicate the process with Trust and Will. Protect what matters most in minutes at trustandwill.com/Peterson and get 20% off. That's 20% off at trustandwill.com/Peterson.
You need a cover story for your sadism, Douglas. And the,
Well,
and the
that's
most
one way of
effective,
seeing
well, the
some of it,
most
yes.
effective cover story for the worst acts of sadism is precisely the use of God's name in vain, right? Because then you combine the worst possible sin, which is demeaning of what's most high, with the worst possible action, with its gleeful delight in the suffering of others. And what do you get? You get 2 for 1 if you're on the side of the sadists. You know, when psychologists started to study what would you say, the manifestation of psychopathy in the normative population, they identified 3 cardinal traits to begin with: Machiavellianism, use of language for instrumental purposes. If I'm a Machiavellian, the only reason I'm communicating with you is to gain something only for me now, right? No communicative intent other than that, right? So it's a false offering. Psychopathy, so that's parasitical predation, right? And narcissism, the desire for unearned status. Okay, well, that was the dark triad, but they had to add sadism to it because those 3 things in combination appear to inevitably lead to sadism, which is exactly that gleeful delight. And then once you've compiled those 4 demonic traits within you, once you've turned yourself over to that spirit, why wouldn't you claim that you were doing it in the name of what's highest? How the hell else would you live with yourself? How would you not stop your soul from shredding? Well, and it is part of that satanic delight to take what's highest and to subvert it most entirely.
Yeah. These are bottomless pits, as you say, Jordan. But there is something I think one can say about the awareness of what you're doing as being wrong to this extent, that and still enjoying it. There's a story I tell.
You're enjoying it because it's wrong, right? That's part of that
and
pride.
also with another layer, which is that you have been taught that the people you're doing this to are subhuman.
Yeah, and you're pretty damn willing to learn it too, because boy, that gives you absolute license to do whatever the hell, whatever possesses you wants you to do.
There was a rather heavy, I'll do it quickly, but a rather heavy day when I went in to see the Hamas terrorists that had been captured alive. And one of them I recognized. And that was a moment where I really did think again about the nature of evil. And yes, it's hard not to think of it in a theological context in this. There was a family who on the 7th were in their home in a small community in the south. And the oldest boy was a teenager, had already gone to the beach with friends, and a landing craft of Hamas came in and they killed him and his friends. And then they went to the community, and the father of the family was there in the house and ran into the bomb shelter with his 2 teenage sons. I think the boys were 10 and 12 or thereabouts. And the terrorists came in, and the father, I've seen the video several times, it's pretty gruesome, but the father takes his 2 sons into the bomb shelter with him, and the Hamas throw a grenade in. And the father threw himself onto the grenade to save his sons. And they come out of the shelter staggering. I mean, both in their underwear, and one of them, his eye had been blown out of his socket, and the other one had lost his hearing. His ear was off, and they come into the main room of the house, and again, it's all on video, and they're both completely disorientated. Of course, one of them is saying, "Where's father?" and the other one is saying, "Didn't you see him?" And then the terrorist who killed their father walks into the room with a Kalashnikov and just looks at the boys, goes to the fridge, opens the fridge and gets out a Diet Coke and starts drinking it in front of them. And also later asks where their mother
That's how you demonstrate that the suffering is irrelevant, right? With that casual consumerist gesture.
Yes.
Right. And that, what would you say? That perversion of hospitality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So inevitably, yes, you get to the question of how does so many people get taught this or encouraged into this? And I was very struck. This is very much in your wheelhouse, but one of the reunions of the survivors of the Nova Party, I got talking to a remarkable woman who was a therapist who was working with them. And these were, of course, all deeply, deeply traumatized young people who were, have difficult time for the rest of their lives. But there was a therapist who'd been working with them who I spoke with who said to me then, and it was something I thought about a lot, which was, don't forget, Douglas, that a psychopath is probably born. Sinois was a type of psychopath, clearly. But she said, don't forget, sociopaths you have to make. And that was something I thought about a lot because, of course, what would happen if you had control of a civilian population like the almost 2 million people in Gaza, a population that doubled in the time that Israel was said to be doing a genocide there, by the way, but park that aside as a mere fact. What would you do if you had a civilian population for 18 years and you were a death cult and you ruled it?